Dr. Sarich received his Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry at the Illinois Institute of Technology in 1955. He also served a distinguished career in the military in the Marine Corps. He then came to Berkeley and was a graduate student in chemistry, and then decided that he wanted to switch fields, and he switched to anthropology and received his PhD in anthropology at UC Berkeley, 1965, I believe. And then he has been teaching on the faculty there ever since. He has written many papers in scientific journals on various topics of biochemistry and anthropology, and has done a lot of research on mammals and other types of animals. Our other speaker tonight is Dr. Duane Gish. Dr. Gish received his PhD in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley, and he's worked with at the Cornell University Medical College on the research staff, and also served at the virus laboratory of the University of California. From 1960 to 71, Dr. Gish was on the research staff at Upjohn Company, and since 1971, he has devoted himself to researching the scientific evidence in the creation-evolution debate. He is currently the vice president of the Institute for Creation Research in California. So with that, we'll let the debate begin, and welcome our first speaker, Dr. Sarich.
I always like to ask myself when I get up in front of an audience like this, what am I doing here? Or more fairly, what are you doing here? Why is this still a relevant topic? Or at least I used to ask myself this until I came to realize that when push comes to shove, practically everybody is a creationist. But in any case, as I said, when push comes to shove, practically everybody is a creationist. Or at least those few that aren't keep their mouths shut, their pens dry, their word process turned off, and use their evolutionary understanding, that is, of how we got where we are, to tell them what we are. And when they know what we are, they use that knowledge and understanding to take advantage of the credulous, overwhelming majority, who continue to believe that they, even if not perhaps everything else, was specially created. Now this debate is going to focus, at least from my perspective, I don't know what Dr. Gish is going to say, you're going to focus on the evolution of molecules and their products, that is, bodies. But we should not delude ourselves into thinking that this is what it's really all about. If it was really a debate about our DNA and our anatomy, neither you would be here nor I would be here, because there would be no interest in it. What it's really all about was laid out, I thought, perfectly during the Christmas season of 1969 by an anonymous editorial writer for the Austin, Texas American. And he was commenting about one of the early papers of Dr. Alan Wilson and myself. And he said, as if things weren't bad enough for us humans, along comes a new anthropological assessment of man's relationship to the apes. We're told that man and the apes may not be nearly as far apart as has been thought. Studies conducted at the University of California at Berkeley by two scientists, here's one of them, suggest that the time of divergence from the common ancestor they're supposed to have shared, stop to the creationists, occurred only 5 million years ago, and not the 30 million held by some scientists. And then the clinching and telling sentence, of course, humans should not resent too deeply this more intimate cousinship to the ape, for the closer the scientists get man to the trees, the easier it should be explained to act. It should be to explain why he acts the way he does. And yes, that writer got it just right. Reading just a little bit of allegory into his words, we see that unquote, the closer we get man to the trees, unquote, simply means, quote, the closer we get him to nature, to his past, unquote, the more sense his behavior makes. So all of this tonight, I mean, you know this deep down, and I know it deep down, all right? We're sort of here under false pretenses. This isn't really all about our bodies and where they come from or came from, but, and I'll use the word advisedly, it's about our souls, or to use the secular equivalent, human nature. To pretend otherwise is pure hypocrisy. Historically, creationism was the norm. In other words, there were no evolutionists around in any human culture until the 18th century. Not just Western culture, but as far as we know from anthropological work, no human culture put forward evolution as an explanation for the origin and diversity of life that they saw around them. No one. And to me, this suggests that deep down somewhere, evolution is not only counterintuitive. Most of you, of course, would say, well, that's because it isn't, all right? But not only is it counterintuitive, but it's also counter-emotional. I think that we have an emotional set against looking at things in an evolutionary manner. If we didn't, then it seems to me out of the hundreds of known cultures, one of them would have looked at a chicken's humerus, that's the upper arm bone, and a human humerus, and I assure you there were plenty of humor around there to look at, all right? We cut up a lot of people in our history. One would have thought that one human culture would have looked at those two and said, gee, they're the same bone. And as far as we know, no one did. So that we started with creation. Everyone was a creationist for the first couple of million years of our ancestry, at least us evolutionists think it's a couple million years, during the time that we had human language and human culture. And it's only in the last couple of hundred years that people have begun to take the notion of evolution somewhat seriously. And given that fact, and remember then that the evolution notion became a competitor, and for most of the scientific world, the winner, only in the 19th century. And we need to remember this. In other words, that this battle, which is still going on, was in some sense fought more than 100 years ago, and you guys lost. This audience is overwhelmingly creationist and politically conservative. But just think about your politically conservative creed. What is one of the major tenets of that creed? The less government, the better. That you know when somebody tries to run the show messes up. And you agree with that, and I agree with that, and that is the fundamental evolutionary message. That you don't need anybody running the show for the show to run itself. What you need, and we're not debating the origin of life or the origin of the universe, okay? We're debating the origin of species and the diversity of life. So we're starting from when life was around. The next step is, where do we get variation from? And one of the basic tenets of creationism is that mutations are always bad. And obviously, if they were, evolution couldn't take place. Now, how do we know that mutations aren't always bad? Well, we can think up some experiments, many of which are done right next door to where I work in biochemistry in Bruce Ames's lab. That is the Ames of the Ames cancer test. And a fundamental aspect of that test is you take mutant bacteria that have been treated with mutagens, such that they are somewhat defective, in that they are unable to live and multiply in the absence of a certain sugar or coenzyme or what have you. You, for example, are mutationally defective relative to many other primates and all other mammals, in that you cannot synthesize vitamin C. Unless you get vitamin C in your diet, you get scurvy. And that is one mutation. And it's known where that difference is. So these bacteria are deficient in that sense. They need their own version of vitamin C to survive and multiply. And what Dr. Ames does is to look for mutagenicity in the world around us. And the way he does this is he plates out these defective bacteria onto petri dishes where the medium is lacking this necessary substance, and then he exposes them to whatever he wants to find out about its mutagenicity. The best mutagen around, of course, is cigarette smoke, which is why the biochemistry department is a non-smoking area. If people smoked in the biochemistry department, Dr. Ames couldn't do his work. But there are, of course, many others. What you then do is you expose these bacteria, which are plated on these dishes, to these things you're testing for mutagenicity. And what you will find typically is that one of them will start growing. Some colony will start growing. Why? Because the mutagen changed it back. That is, reversed the defect by adding in another mutation. And so now these originally defective bacteria turn themselves around and did just fine, thank you, because they no longer needed that thing was not in the medium. Or, for example, we all know that the growing resistance of many microorganisms, disease microorganisms, to penicillin, streptomycin, and so forth, is a terrible problem. How do you suppose that happened? Because they weren't originally resistant, but they were exposed to a selective agency, in this case, some antibiotic. Mutations are occurring all the time, and some mutation induced a certain degree of protection. And indeed, sometimes they can go so far that the bacteria can no longer live without penicillin. So we know very well from countless studies on microorganisms and many others that mutations aren't always bad, and that mutations in the face of a selective agency can produce change which allows an organism to live in a niche where it could not live before. It, for example, allows bacteria to live in a penicillin-filled world or a penicillin-filled body. So time we've got, and I trust we're not going to argue about it tonight, mutations are not always bad. Now what about the organization part? That is, it is often argued from various perspectives that you can't have organization developing spontaneously. that the world is continually running down, presumably from an originally perfect state. And I'd like to point out to you that that also isn't true, and one can demonstrate it very easily. And let me proceed here. We often get organization without an organizer, local organization, here, for example, in the form of a tornado. California isn't blessed with those things, but we see them on TV all the time at the appropriate times of the year. Now, I guarantee you that that is local organization spontaneously organized under appropriate climatic conditions. And that organization, of course, when it runs into something, produces a great deal of disorganization. But that doesn't stop tornadoes from forming, because the next day or the next month or the next year, we're going to have tornadoes forming again under appropriate conditions. So you can get local organization. The world is not running down. So that's another objection. Now, let me proceed to a somewhat sticky area. I will apologize beforehand for this to both, well, to everybody here who's going to have troubles coming to grips with it, and to my few supporters whose peers have told me in the past that I really shouldn't talk about this because it's just too hard. But I am trusting to your intelligence, and we'll see that it really isn't too hard. Because what is difficult is to set up situations where the creationist perspective and the evolutionist perspective give very different and, most important, testable hypotheses. We need a situation where the creationists say one thing and the evolutionists say something else, and we can actually go to the lab or somewhere and test it. And one place that we can certainly do this is with molecules, which are both my line and Dr. Gish's. We both got our PhDs at Berkeley, and we both got them working in a biochemistry lab. Not the same lab. Now, whether you're an evolutionist or a creationist, there is no doubt that the differences between species are encoded in their DNA. We may not be able to break the code in terms of my being able to tell you where the DNA that gives me 5 fingers of this shape and so forth, where that DNA is. We have not the foggiest notion, but we know it's there because we can have mutations occurring which would give me less than 5 fingers or more than 5 fingers or no hand at all. So the differences between species, for sure, are encoded in the DNA. And the DNA forms proteins. So we can look at proteins comparatively. We can, for example, line up, let's talk about a protein called cytochrome C, and we can line it up in the tuna and the silkworm, and we note that in the tuna we have leucine, phenylalanine, glycine, arginine, and so forth and so on. There's 20 different amino acids found in proteins. And in the silkworm we see that where the tuna has leucine, the silkworm has glycine. 5 down the line, the tuna has lysine, the silkworm has histidine, and so forth. We can count these differences. We can do this at the protein level, and we can do the same thing now with improved technology at the DNA level. So in those 10 positions, we have 3 differences, about 30%. And overall, out of the 104 positions, we have 31 differences, that is about 30%. And if we can then compare the tuna to a couple of other fish, there's 2% difference, 8%. If we compare it to a dog, 17%. To a silkworm, we've got 30%, and so forth and so on. So we are able now to look at species and objectively quantitate differences between them. All right? Now, the creationists have noticed this too, and in a book which Dr. Gish has with him, and my copy got stolen in Florida at one of these things. In any case, we are able to compare the distance between various organisms and a bacterium. And I've underlined the differences that we're going to be interested in. The difference between one of the bacteria and horse is 64%, pigeon is 64%, tuna 65, silkworm 65, wheat 66, and a yeast 69%. Okay? Now, what does a creationist do with this? Well, he writes a little diagram of this sort, which is just a description of those numbers. There's a bacterium, and those are the distances along the radii of the circle leading to the various eukaryotic organisms. So those are those differences, 64, 5, 6, and 9. Now one looks at this, and one says, what does this predict? Well, I'm not sure what it predicts, because I'm not at all sure what is supposed to be implied as to the difference, for example, between horse and pigeon. And if one looked at that diagram directly, then the difference between horse and pigeon would be 128%, which is a little difficult, okay? It's difficult to be more different than 100%. But it just says nothing about that relationship. And of course, it's the creationist position that horse and this bacterium have always been 64% different. Okay? They were created 64% different. And so that this diagram is simply a representation of those numbers I showed you. And indeed, although I don't expect you to be able to read this, I'm just putting this here so I'm not inventing it, okay? The numbers that we're talking about are the ones circled here on the outside. And I can look up here, and you'll see it in larger type, that the difference between horse and pigeon is 11%. Okay? Now, the question is, who can better explain the differences inside? Tuna, silkworm 30%, horse, pigeon 11%, and so forth and so on. Well, what is our hypothesis? The evolutionary prediction is the following: that there's a difference that there is a connection between tuna and silkworm or any other pair of species living or extinct. In other words, that tuna and silkworm are connected by a real and unbroken sequence of populations. That's the descent part. And that the difference between the two accumulated along that line since the two had a common ancestor. That's the modification part. Evolution is descent with modification. And what we're saying is that there was a common ancestor back here, and from that point, a certain amount of change occurred along the line leading to tuna, a different amount of change occurred along the line leading to silkworm, and the two amounts of change put together equal the difference between the two species today. And more important, that this will be true no matter how many species are involved. In other words, what we're saying is that there will be a tree, a unique genealogy linking all of those species so that I am able to go from the silkworm to, let us say, yeast, and add up L, F, and E, and get the difference between the silkworm and yeast, which is 40%. That's the prediction. And let's see what it looks like. Now there's the differences that we're talking about. And what we're going to do now is ask the question, can't I test the evolutionary hypothesis by getting a tree out of these data, a unique tree? And let me point out that if you want to know how many possible trees there are for 7 species, there are 10,395 different ways of arranging 7 species. If you go to 10 species, there's 2 million different ways of doing it. So this is a nasty test for any theory. All right. So those are our numbers. And now we're going to ask the following. Well, I'm not going to work it through. You want to know how to do this, come to Berkeley and take my class. Okay? But in any case, that's the solution. And it is a solution, as I'll show you. And if you want to play games with it, I'll be happy to send you the problem, but not the answer. Okay? In any case, what we're saying is that the solution takes the following form. Horse goes with pigeon, then tuna, then silkworm, then wheat and yeast go together, and then the bacterium. And what does it say? It says that the difference between yeast and let's say horse and silkworm will be 6 plus 2, 8, plus 6, 14, plus 13, 27. That is, to get from horse to silkworm, you have to go through 27% change. Horse to silkworm is 27%. Okay? So now if you take this tree and fill in the upper half, the right-hand side of the matrix, we get the following. Oops. I'll just leave this up for a couple seconds for those of you who can add without counting on your fingers to see that I'm not cheating. But in any case, what I then get is the right-hand upper half of the matrix. The numbers on the right are the ones that I get off my tree. Okay, one tree out of 10,395. The numbers on the left is what I started with. And remember that the evolutionary hypothesis says that this should be possible. If it doesn't come out, if you can't do it, then your system is not behaving as an evolutionary system. And I chose these data because they are in this book, Evolution: A Theory in Crisis. So in other words, they're not data I chose from just to make them fit nicely. They're data that Michael Denton presented. And if I am now to look at the differences, that is, what is the lack of fit? This lists the lack of fit. In other words, when it says 0, that means that the tree distance is exactly equal to the experimental distance. There's no difference of more than 2, so that the total lack of fit is 16. The total amount of change on the tree is 898. the percent lack of fit is 1.8. So this says that the evolution model explains 98.2% of the data. Is there an alternative that begins to do as well? Remember, 10,395 possible trees, and we get one. Now, there are, of course, non-molecular data. After all, we weren't able to do this until about 1961 or so at all. And certainly the idea of evolution was put forward long before that. And it was put forward, as I said, first because people began recognizing that the Earth was very old. They didn't know about mutations. Okay. Second, because they recognized that forms of life seem to succeed one another. In other words, one does not find elephants and dinosaurs in the same deposits, or whales and marine reptiles which were contemporaneous with the dinosaurs, or bats and pterosaurs, or so forth and so on. There clearly were successions of life forms. And in addition, people began noticing that there were some striking similarities. And you can do this for yourself at the dinner table. The next time you have a chicken wing, extract the humerus. Don't extract one from your family member, but go to somewhere in a book and find out what a human humerus looks like. And then ask yourself why a chicken's humerus looks like a human humerus, since they don't do the same thing with those two limbs. And of course, anatomists noticed this long ago and noticed that the upper limb tended to have one upper bone with a sort of semi-spherical articular surface at one end. Then it articulated with two bones here, distally, further out. And then there tended to be a sort of complicated mess in here. And then we had a whole bunch of long series of small rectangularly or cuboid-shaped bones that are in us the fingers or the whale's flipper or the sea lion's flipper or the bird's wing or what have you. And this is true for the sea turtle, the penguin, the sea lion, and the dolphin. To compare it in yourselves, you've got the same situation. You notice one upper bone with this hemispherical articular surface, two lower arm bones here, kind of a mess right here, and then some long bones composing your fingers and your hand. This is across the board. All terrestrial vertebrates look like that. Almost all. I mean, few of them have lost limbs completely, so that they don't have any limbs, they can't look like that, all right? Like snakes. But even terrestrial vertebrates, where we think they went back to the sea, have the situation. I showed you the whale flipper, and here's in situ, one upper bone articulating here with the scapula or shoulder blade, two bones here, a mess in here, and the long finger bones, very much like you or most any other vertebrate. Now I submit that if you want to believe that this was specially created this way, I really think you're insulting the Creator. by suggesting that he, or maybe she, was so devoid of imagination that he couldn't produce limbs more appropriately structured for what they were doing. I rather doubt that. And finally, let me point out in this realm, point out one area which creationists are fond of bringing up. And that's the matter of, so to speak, lack of intermediates. Now, this is an area where the difference between the evolutionary perspective and the creationist perspective is not that great. Because let's look at it as the data really are. Suppose we're looking for some particular, quote, intermediate form, unquote. There's about roughly 250,000 fossil species known. All right? There's at least 1 million living species known. And from the evolutionary data, that's if you believe in evolution at all, a species tends to have a lifespan of around 1 to 5 million years, depending on what group you're looking at, but that's a good average. So that means, so let's say 3 million for a middle number, and let's say 1 billion years of time, which sort of encompasses such a fossil record as we have. So that means that every 3 million years, we will replace those million species on the average by 1 million new species. So we would have then had, over 1 billion years, 333 such replacements. 333 such over our 1 billion years. And that means that the total number of species that would have ever lived is somewhere around 300 million. That is 1 million new ones every 3 million years for 1 billion years. But of those, only 250,000 are found as fossils. So this means that only 0.07% of all the species that ever lived, that is if the evolutionary perspective is correct, are found as fossils. So if you're looking for a particular intermediate, you have less than 1 chance in 1,000 of actually finding it. Remember, 1% is 1 in 100, and we're talking less than 1/10 of 1%. So you see, this one, in a way, is something the creationists can't lose. Because both the evolutionary model and the creationist model say that the probability of finding an intermediate is very low. The creationists say 0. The evolutionists say almost 0. See, it's not a very powerful test. And even if we find forms that are intermediate, then all the creationist has to say is, well, where's the intermediate between X and Y? And so forth and so on. For every one we find, there will undoubtedly be at least 999 that we don't find. And so it's not a nice, neat test. The way comparative anatomy is, compared to the way the time scale is, compared to the way the molecules are, and so forth and so on. Those old-timers in the audience can recognize this 1938 picture of Dorothy Lamour and Jiggs, a chimpanzee. And I just show you the picture to remind you of the striking similarities between yourselves and the African apes. You just put Dorothy Lamour in a fur coat, tight-fitting fur coat, and we're in business. Why don't we go on to the next one? And here we have a chimp termiting. This is in Africa. This is a live chimp. And what he's doing, he's licking a grass stalk, putting it into a termite mound, wiggling around until the termites stick to it, and then he pulls it out gently and gets a meal. Okay? And one can relate very readily, at least I can, to this rapt attention. It looks just like the Berkeley students are going to be looking at my exam next week or the week after, all right? Next. Now here we have a chimpanzee, no zippers there. This is a real live chimpanzee, stealing some bananas out of a forest in Zaire about 25 years ago from Time Life book. And I like to show this picture as perhaps the best one I know of what you looked like 5 million years ago. That's what you looked like, okay? No, you looked like it. All of us did. Next one. How do we know that? Well, we have some bone. This is a series of Australopithecine fossils from South Africa where we have the hip area. And we have that hip area, and we know that we differ from chimps anatomically, most strikingly, by being bipeds. We walk on our hind limbs, and we have a big brain. Next. And if we look at those hips, the one on the right is from South Africa, the one on the left is Lucy's. And in both cases, I will show you, those hips look human, in particular because they have this notch here and there, so-called sciatic notch. And we know that they look human because, next, in a chimpanzee, if we look at the pelvis from the side, looking at the hip socket here, we basically see only a plane. We see very little of the surface of the hip. Next one. And here you see at the chimp's pelvis, no sciatic notch really evident. So what's happened, never mind whether it happened, it looks as though, if evolution is correct, what's happened is that the pelvis has been squashed down and broadened out in human evolution. Next. And we can see this with a chimp on the right, a modern human on the left, and Lucy in the middle. And again, I'm not going to argue this point. You have eyes just the way I have eyes, and you can ask yourselves whether this thing is an ape's pelvis or something rather more closely related to us. I think the answer is rather obvious. Next. And here is the pelvis, the South African pelvis put together just to illustrate to you how human it looks. The gray splotchy stuff is real bone, fossilized, and the white stuff is plaster. And here's a modern human pelvis articulated on the right. And I submit that the thing on the left looks an awful lot like the thing on the right and doesn't look very much like an ape at all. And the next one. And here is that pelvis again with the chimps on the right and a modern human portion on the left. I just want to point out to you, and we're running low on time, let me just close out my little piece here, that we have fossils which show us the beginnings of a human appearing adaptation. Those fossils, and again, you can look at them just as well as I can look at them, those fossils look as though they belong to a bipedal form. On the other hand, the rest of the body of that animal doesn't look like us at all. In particular, the skull is the skull of a chimpanzee. The brain is the size of a chimpanzee's brain. And so as far as humans are concerned, what do you want other than Australopithecus as an intermediate form? You have two major differences between ourselves and the apes, one of which involves the lower limb and the fact that we're bipeds, and we have bipeds there in the fossil record. of roughly 2.5 to 3.5 million years ago. On the other hand, as far as the increase in brain size is concerned, hasn't happened at all yet. It's for later on. And in many other aspects of the anatomy, and we could go through it, we're not going to right now, you have something intermediate between the degree of humanness in the pelvis and the degree of humanness or apiness in the skull. So I'm trying to run through quickly the sorts of things which make us think that evolution is real and that creationism explains nothing. Dr. Gish will tell you the opposite.
What we are here to discuss is how did the universe and the living organisms that it contained come into existence. Did they come into existence by a combination of naturalistic, mechanistic processes which are still operating today? That is the evolutionary position. Or did they come into being through a theistic, supernatural, spatial creation process, as the creation scientists maintain? Now, one of the more popular theories on the origin of the universe is that some billions of years ago, all the energy and matter in the universe was crammed together in a huge cosmic egg. That is, everything in your body, everything in the entire universe was in this huge cosmic egg. Now, nobody has the foggiest notion of where it came from or how it got there. Someone suggested perhaps the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. Well, then you got to explain where the cosmic chicken came from. Anyhow, there it was, and then for some inexplicable reason, this cosmic egg exploded. And out of that explosion, hydrogen gas was generated. Some helium, but mainly hydrogen gas and helium. And it expanded throughout the universe. And that's all there was. Essentially just hydrogen gas. That was the universe. And somehow we are told stars created themselves and galaxies created themselves. Our solar system created itself. Life created itself here on this planet. And that first form of life then evolved into everything living today, including people. And we have about 30 trillion cells in our bodies, about 12 billion of which are found in our 3-pound human brain. And since each brain cell is connected to 10,000 other brain cells, that means we have more than 100 trillion connections in the human brain. I expected Dr. Cyrus to shoot at me, but I didn't expect to get some machine gun fire from the bleachers over here. All right, well, let's try it again. What I'm trying to illustrate here is this incredible complexity that we must explain. Supposedly, you see, we have gone from hydrogen gas to people. Someone has said if that is true, then we could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. Well, now, people, please don't laugh. That Dr. Cyrus believes that. Evolutionists believe that. You see, there was nothing but hydrogen gas then. Now there's people. So obviously, we had to come from hydrogen gas. So according to the evolutionists, then, hydrogen gas is your creator. Now, as a scientist, I consider that idea to be absolutely incredible. I don't know how anybody could believe it, but they do believe it. They must believe it, you see. And this has all happened by natural processes which are still operating today. Well, I propose to show that evolution theory violates some of the most well-established laws of science. I suggest further that the notion that our marvelously complex, highly ordered universe and the incredibly complex living things that it contains originated by chance processes is simply preposterous. This is nothing more than pseudo-scientific 20th century mythology, a nature myth that man has invented to explain his origin without God. Finally, I propose to show that the fossil record, which should provide unequivocal evidence for evolution, if evolution is really true, is terribly embarrassing to evolutionary theory, but provides powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now, how do we define creation? What do we mean by creation? We define creation as this concept, this truth, we believe, that the universe could not have created itself naturally, that life could never have arisen spontaneously on this planet through a combination of natural processes, and if they could not have created themselves naturally, then they had to be created supernaturally. We believe the Creator created the stars, the galaxies, our solar system. He created life on this planet, and He created each basic type of plant and animal, what we might call the created kinds. And that none of these kinds then have arisen from a common ancestor. They were each specially created by processes which are not operating anywhere in the universe today. Now, how would we define the general theory of evolution? Well, now, if we may have that first slide, please, we'll see the definition of evolution according to Sir Julian Huxley, the British biologist and evolutionist. This is how this evolutionist defines the theory of evolution. He says, quote, "Evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation." End of quote. So you can see, ladies and gentlemen, that according to this theory of evolution, this definition of the theory of evolution, everything originated through a process of self-transformation. You see, God is not necessary. God was not involved. God, by the very definition of this theory, is excluded. Matter was sufficient to do it all. Furthermore, it's a directional process. We started with the chaos of the Big Bang. We ended up with the cosmos. We started with the simplicity of hydrogen gas. We ended up with the complexity of the human brain. Always going ever and upward to higher and higher levels of organization. And notice that it includes everything, not only stars and planets and bacterium and animals and so forth, and humans, but our consciousness, our ability to remember the past, our ability to plan for the future. Our very faith in God is the product of evolution. As Dr. Sarich very plainly stated here tonight, God did not create man, but man created God. And that is the concept we have before us, according to this theory of evolution. Now, if that is really true, how would we know whether it's true or not? Were you there? Was Dr. Sarich there when life arose on this planet? Was he there when the universe came into existence? No, he wasn't there. I wasn't there. There were no humans there. There were no human observers to the origin of the universe or the origin of life. There were no human observers to the origin of a single living thing. All we can do is try to infer what may have happened in the past. Well, there is some evidence by which we may infer what did happen or what could have happened. The evolutionist says that evolution has occurred according to natural laws and processes operating right now. Therefore, there must be no contradictions between the theory of evolution and the natural laws and processes now operating in the universe. Well, what would we expect? Well, if we start with hydrogen gas, and it evolved all the way to people, with all these intermediates, then matter must have that ability. Matter must have that tendency. Matter must have this inherent capability of transforming itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. That obviously must be true. And we should have been able to identify that tendency of matter, and we should have a natural law which describes this tendency of matter. On the other hand, if creation is true, we'd never predict such a thing. Matter would not have an ability to promote itself to higher and higher levels of organization. But if anything has happened since creation to change the original created state, since that could not promote matter upward, it could only cause matter to go downward. Based upon creation, then, matter might have a natural tendency to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. We have diametrically opposed theory. According to evolution, things went that way. According to creation, things should be going that way, if in any direction at all. All right, let's go out there in the real world. Let's take a look. Let's see what's going on out there. Well, first of all, let me point out that no scientist has ever detected any inherent tendency of matter to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. Certainly not in any direction or in any way required by the theory of evolution. I might hasten to add, we're not talking about tornadoes, we're not talking about hurricanes. That doesn't evolve, that doesn't go to people. We're talking about evolution. We're not talking about storms, we're talking about evolution. This necessity of molecules to organize themselves to create a living thing, and then for living things to evolve into people. Now, no scientist has ever recognized any inherent tendency of matter to do that. On the other hand, we have recognized a universal natural tendency for all systems to go precisely in the opposite direction. There is a universal natural tendency for all systems to deteriorate, to run down, to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. That tendency is so universal, so all-pervasive, so all-unfailing, it's called a natural law, the second law of thermodynamics. I'm going to allow Dr. Isaac Asimov to define that law for us. Dr. Asimov is a very famous evolutionist, written more than 300 books or so. I had a debate with Dr. Asimov in the pages of Science Digest, October 1981. In my argument, in my initial statement, I quoted the following statement by Dr. Asimov and challenged him to explain how evolution could take place in the light of these facts which he himself has stated. May we have the next slide, please? This statement appeared in Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970. Here's this statement by Dr. Asimov referring to the second law of thermodynamics. He says, and I quote, "Another way of stating the second law, then, is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly." Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me if that is what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, the most well-proven and tested scientific law known in science, evolution, is in trouble. According to the theory of evolution, everything went this way. We went from chaos to the cosmos, from disorder to order, from simple to complex. But according to the second law, everything has a natural tendency to go in the opposite direction. As a matter of fact, the entire universe is running down. It is deteriorating. It's constantly becoming less and less orderly, more and more random. That's true of everything, from the scale of the galaxies to the level of the molecule. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, if there is no God, or if God would not intervene, this universe is certain to die. Because you see, every star in the universe is burning up its fuel. Inevitably, the day will come when every star has exhausted its fuel, and then the lights will go out. Now, I would like Dr. Gish-Sarich to explain. I asked Dr. Asimov to explain. I've asked many evolutionists to explain. this problem, this question, you see, if the natural laws and natural processes which now govern the universe are leading to its death and destruction, and if, as evolutionists believe, these natural laws and natural processes are all there is and all there ever has been, how then could those same natural laws create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very natural laws and processes which are destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? Well, what sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? That's irrational. That's not science, that's pseudoscience. The second law of thermodynamics, without exception, always applies to an isolated system. And in the evolutionary view, the universe is an isolated system. Nobody did any work on it. Nobody brought in anything from the outside. Everything that happened within the natural universe was a process of self-transformation. The second law of thermodynamics says such a system can go in one direction and one direction only. It will, with time, go downward. It will become less complex, less ordered, less organized. It will become more random, more disorganized, without exception. And yet evolutionists believe the universe is an isolated system which started in a state of primordial chaos and disorder and the simplicity of hydrogen gas and transformed itself into this incredibly complex universe we have today, including people. That is absolutely physically impossible. Anybody who believes that just believes it. And it's irrational faith. It is not rational at all. Totally unscientific. Now, let's go to this fact of organization and complexity. Dr. Gish-Sarich believes that organization can come into being without an organizer. That you can have design and purpose without any purpose or without any design. He is very much determined to prove in a rational way that there's no rationality in the universe. But I believe that there is. That the evidence for design, the evidence for purpose, is evidence for deliberate, intelligent creation. If Dr. Gish-Sarich was walking along a hillside and he looked down here and here's some rocks and pebbles, he would very reasonably conclude that those rocks and pebbles formed naturally by time and chance. But if among those rocks and pebbles he saw an arrowhead, do you suppose he would assume that the arrowhead just formed naturally? That there was no organizer for this organized form of matter? That it just happened to come about by accident? Not for 1 second. He would immediately assume that that arrowhead had been created, that he could see the form and pattern. He knew that it had a purpose. And he would ascribe then the origin of that arrowhead to an intelligent creator, not to a beaver, not to a snake, not to a monkey, but to a human, and only to a human. Yes, there is evidence, you see, from organization for the organizer. There is evidence for a planner from a plan. Well, what about life? Does it give evidence for purpose? Does it give evidence for organization? Does it give evidence for complexity? Yes, I should say so. And absolutely there's no way possible that this could have created itself. May we have the next slide, please? Now, ladies and gentlemen, the most primitive living cell imaginable would have to have hundreds of different kinds of protein, including hundreds of different kinds of enzymes. Now, enzymes are very complex proteins, and enzymes are catalysts which makes chemical reactions go very rapidly, which ordinarily would go slowly. You cannot have life without enzymes. The most primitive form of life imaginable would have to have hundreds of different kinds of enzymes. And of course, in addition to this, there'd have to be many hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules, which are even much more complex than protein and many other molecules. Well, here is one protein. This is ribonuclease. It's an enzyme, a digestive enzyme. This protein has 124 amino acids. That's not a very big protein. The average protein has 400 amino acids. This only has 124. Now in protein today, there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. Now, how did this protein come into existence? How did those amino acids happen to be arranged in just precisely that order so we had this enzyme, ribonuclease? How, on the other hand, did the 287 amino acids in hemoglobin just happen to get in that order so we had hemoglobin, the red blood protein that binds oxygen? What about human growth hormone? It has 188 amino acids, 20 different kinds, arranged in precise order. So we have a hormone. Here we have an enzyme, or hemoglobin. Why does each of these proteins have that incredible biological activity? Because of this precise arrangement. How did that happen? Dr. Gish-Sarich says, evolutionists say, just by accident, just by chance. There was no creator, there was no biochemist, there was no intelligence, there was no purpose, there was no goal. It just happened by chemistry and physics. Let me tell you, chemistry and physics are just dumb things. They don't know how to put amino acids together to make an enzyme or hemoglobin. It just had to be strictly by chance. Well, one can easily calculate the probability that something like that would happen. If you have 20 different kinds of amino acids, the probability of getting 124 of those in precisely that order is 1 over 20 times itself 124 times. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that would never happen. Or you could try it 1 trillion times every second for 5 billion years, and the probability you'd end up with precisely that arrangement is, for all practical purposes, nil. And even if 1 trillion different ways would work, your probability would still be nil. Now, let me try to illustrate with something more simple. If I'd ask 17 people to line up here in a certain order, then rearrange yourselves in a second order, in a third order, in a fourth order, keep doing that time and time again, but never arranging yourself twice in the same order. How many times do you suppose 17 people could line up? More than 355 trillion different ways. More than 355 trillion different ways. Just 17 people. But you don't believe me. All right, after the meeting, get 16 of your friends together and try it. This universe would be gone before you'd finish trying. 355 trillion. That means if I wrote their names down on a piece of paper and they just lined up, they'd have only one chance out of 355 trillion of getting their arrangement in that order. Here's 124. Impossible, ladies and gentlemen, impossible. But what if it did happen? What would you have? Only one single molecule of one single protein. But to get life started, you'd have to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of protein, billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of DNA and RNA molecules, and much more. And you still would never get a living cell. Remember the second law of thermodynamics, ladies and gentlemen? Would these molecules have a natural tendency to organize themselves into something complex? Absolutely not. There wouldn't be the slightest tendency for that to happen. You know what would happen? All those molecules would rapidly fall apart. That's what happened. If Dr. Gish-Sarich has ever isolated a protein or a DNA and RNA, he knows he'd have to put it probably in an ampule under nitrogen, seal it, and put it in a deep freeze to try to preserve it. And that doesn't succeed anyhow because it just slowly goes to pieces. And if you had all these molecules floating around in the water, they'd go to pieces rapidly. Next slide, please. But you see, they'd have to get organized in a very precise fashion. They'd have to form a membrane. They'd have to form energy factories, protein factories. You'd have to have all that genetic material, and it would all have to be put together in just a precise fashion, just like the works in your watch. You can't get a watch by taking all these parts, putting them in a bag, and shake them up. You never get a watch that way. Why, if even one single part was not just in the right place, the watch won't function. And the same is true here. And ladies and gentlemen, every detail of that cell, every detail of the structure and function of that cell demonstrates purpose. Dr. Gish-Sarich says that doesn't demonstrate anything, doesn't prove anything. Well, I say the evidence for that purposefulness demands intelligent, deliberate creation. The idea that that thing just put itself together is simply ridiculous. It's absurd. Next slide, please. Here we see an article that appeared in a London newspaper. August 14th, 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Who are these two scientists? Sir Fred Hoyle, one of the world's foremost astronomers, and his friend and colleague, Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, also a very famous astronomer. Now, when these scientists became interested in the problem of the origin of life, they were both atheists. Had no inclination whatsoever to accept the creationist viewpoint. First, they calculated the probability of life evolving on this planet in 5 billion years, making certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started, then calculating the probability that this would just put itself together by chance. The probability, 1 chance out of 10 to the 40,000th power. That's 1 chance out of the number 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, that is absolute flatly zero. But they said, after all, we have 100 billion galaxies. There's 100 billion stars in each galaxy. Let us assume that every star in the universe has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let's calculate the probability that life could have evolved somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low, it was essentially nil. Sir Fred Hoyle has declared that the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, these two scientists now have concluded that the evolution of life by a natural evolutionary process is simply impossible. And if it could not have created itself naturally, then it had to be created supernaturally. And therefore, they said, there must be a God. Now, they don't believe the Bible. They don't believe the Genesis record of creation, not at all. But they do believe that wherever life exists, it had to be created. They are, therefore, creationists. Now, did they become creationists because of their religion? Obviously not. They became creationists in spite of their religion, because they were atheists when they began these studies. It was the compelling evidence of the scientific record, you see. The compelling nature of the scientific evidence forced these two scientists to acknowledge the fact of creation. Pierre Grasset, the most distinguished of all French zoologists, his knowledge of the living world is encyclopedic. He says, I want to remind biologists that the only evidence for evolution must be ascertained from the fossil record. There is no other place where we can find the evidence for evolution. Dr. Gish-Sarich disagrees with this distinguished scientist from France and an evolutionist. Yes, the fossil record, if that fossil record does not produce evidence for evolution, then something is wrong with evolution. And it certainly also should agree with creation. Now, Dr. Gish-Sarich mentions that the chance of finding a fossil of an intermediate is so small that you can forget about it. Well, he said 333 million species must have existed in the past, and he said the chances of finding an intermediate is only 1 out of 1,000. Well, if that's true, by his own mathematics, we should have found 333,000 intermediates. Because if you have 333 million divided by 1,000, 1 chance out of 1,000, that's 333,000. Our museum should be loaded with these things. And let's just cut it by 10, or by 10 to 1/10. Let's just say that you could only find 1/10 of these 333,000. That's still 33,000. Why, that's train loads of these things, ladies and gentlemen. We ought to have these things lying all over the place. There would be no doubt about the fact of evolution. On the other hand, if creation is true, ladies and gentlemen, we would not expect to find any intermediate or in-between kind. We would expect each created kind, each basic type of plant and animal to appear fully formed right at the start. There would be no evolutionary ancestors, no evidence that one thing gradually changed into another. If a fish changed into an amphibian, we ought to find intermediates showing the fins of the fish gradually becoming feet and legs. If a reptile changed into a bird, we ought to have intermediates showing scales changing into feathers and forelimbs changing into wings. And if ape changed into people, we ought to have numerous examples of intermediate forms. These processes supposedly required many, many millions of years of time. The intermediate population would be enormous. Dr. Cyrus is trying to tell us there'd only be one single intermediate. Why, that's absurd, ladies and gentlemen. If a clam changed into a fish, why, you would start out with a clam and makes a slight change, and then another change, and another change, and numerous changes during 100 million years. And there'd be tremendous populations of all of these intermediates. Why, the number of intermediates that lived and died would number in the billions times billions, and probably billions again. And that would be true of every transition, because you see, the transition is gradual. The transition involves numerous intermediate stages. And so we ought to have tremendous numbers of these intermediate forms. We do have 250,000 different fossil species. Tens of thousands of those should be undoubted transitional form if evolution is true. On the other hand, if creation is true, we would not expect to find these intermediate forms. Well, actually, evolutionists have acknowledged that the fossil record is a great embarrassment to evolution theory. Mark Ridley is a British zoologist. He is an evolutionist. He published an article in New Scientist, 25th of June, 1981. And he realizes the fossil record is an embarrassment to his theory of evolution, so he wants to downgrade the importance of the fossil record, as does Dr. Sarich, because he realizes the fossil record doesn't support his theory. And this is what he says: no real evolutionist uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to spatial creation. End of quote. Listen, did you hear what he said? No real evolutionist would even try to use the fossil record to defend evolution theory versus creation. Let's take a look, first of all, at this idea of human evolution. May we have the next slide, please? I'm sorry, our cameraman is going to have to move maybe. Oh, well, it's okay. Let's take a look at the track record of evolutionists. You know what I say when evolutionists come up with something? I say, let's wait. Let's see if it stands the test of time. Here's one that did not stand the test of time: Piltdown Man. This was based upon a few fragments of a jaw and a skull found in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England in 1912. The jawbone was very ape-like, but the teeth appeared to be man-like. The skull was quite man-like, but the bones appeared to be very old. They put it all together in a single individual, combining these ape-like features with human-like characteristics, and we had Piltdown Man, the so-called subhuman ancestor of man, 500,000 years old. And for nearly a half a century, it was a consensus of the world's greatest authorities that Piltdown Man was our ancestor, until 1950, when a chemist exposed the hoax. It was not an anthropologist that did this, it was a chemist. A chemist demonstrated that someone had taken some chemicals, treated these bones with chemicals to make them look old. Someone had filed the teeth with a file to make them look man-like, planted the bones in the gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. 500 books and pamphlets were written on Piltdown Man until this hoax was exposed. And it's incredible how many ape-like features these scientists could see in that human skull, and how many man-like features they could see in that modern ape's jaw. They wanted to believe it. They were seeing something that wasn't there, you see. Another example is the Nebraska Man. A single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska in 1922. Brought to the attention of several leading evolutionists, and they were very excited by the discovery of this tooth because it seemed to have some characteristics intermediate between ape and man. They weren't quite sure was it an ape-like man or a man-like ape. Based upon the descriptions of these scientists, the Illustrated London News published a picture of this so-called Nebraska Man. In 1922, we see that in the next slide. All right, I hope you can see that. On the right, we have the Nebraska Man. On his left, we see his wife. We see the tools that they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Isn't science a really exciting substance or field? It really is incredible, isn't it, what we can do in science from such a trifling investment of facts. Well, a few years later, they discovered some additional remains of this creature. He was neither an ape-like man nor a man-like ape. It turned out to be a pig. That's right, it was nothing more than a pig's tooth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me say, and my apologies to Dr. Sarich, I believe this is a case where an evolutionist made a man out of a pig, and the pig made a monkey out of the evolutionist. And the next slide shows another example. The Neanderthal man. The remains of the Neanderthal man were discovered about 1860. Subsequently, remains of this creature was found in Europe and Asia and Africa and Israel. In 1908, a nearly complete skeleton was found in France. And based upon the appearance of this skeleton, it looked like these creatures could not walk upright, not quite. They sort of shuffled along, bent kneed and so forth and so on. And so Neanderthal people was portrayed as these primitive subhuman creatures, long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhumans. Homo neanderthalensis. And for nearly a century, we had this view of these Neanderthal people. Well, it was discovered subsequently, many fossils of these creatures walking fully erect. It was then just realized that fossil they found in France in 1908 was of an arthritic old man. The only reason he couldn't walk upright, he had a bad case of arthritis. And when they x-rayed the bones and teeth of these people, they found they all suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency which causes the bones to become soft and deformed. They decided finally that all of these primitive features were pathological and not genetic, and therefore that Neanderthal man was fully human, Homo sapien. In the next slide, we see the modern version of Neanderthal man. Try it again. Oh, we got that swan eating a marshmallow in a snowstorm again. Can you push that slide down? Well, as a modern version of Neanderthal man, as I hope we can see, Neanderthal man is reluctant to get evolved here. But the picture from the American Museum of Natural History shows a modern human and not a subhuman creature. About 30 years ago, a couple of scientists published an article about the Neanderthal people, and they said, now really, if you take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath and put him in a business suit, place him on the New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, that was 30 years ago, and of course today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut, would you? In some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath, and he'd fit in very nicely. Well, that's okay. That's all right. We'll just take it on faith. He has been upgraded to human. You see, Neanderthal man was not our ancestor. He was man. Nebraska man was not our ancestor, nothing but a pig's tooth. Piltdown man was not our ancestor, just simply a hoax. And so it goes on and on. There's many other examples. Now, on the next slide, please. We see the skulls of Australopithecus. Dr. Sarich has talked about and showed you the pelts of a number of these creatures compared to the human. And he said that Lucy, one of these creatures, was an ape from the neck up, jaws, teeth, face, and brain of an ape. But Dr. Sarich and other evolutionists claim that these creatures walked upright. Well, you can indeed see that they're very primitive, very typically of the ape. Did they walk upright? That's what Johansen says. That's what Richard Leakey says. That's what Dr. Sarich says. That's what most evolutionists claim. We see that in our textbook. We see it in National Geographic and so forth. But is it really true? Well, according to some real experts in the field, it is not true. One of these experts is Sir Solly Zuckerman. Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham in England. A man who had a scientific team that rarely numbered less than 4 that studied these creatures for more than 15 years. One of his former students, Dr. Charles Oxnard, is now professor of anatomy at the University of Southern California Medical School, director of their graduate program. Both of these scientists are evolutionists. They've studied these creatures for many years. Lord Zuckerman and Dr. Oxnard studied fossils of these creatures that are supposed to be 1 to 2 million years younger than Lucy, more recent in time. Therefore, they should be more advanced. They should be more man-like. Lord Zuckerman says the evidence indicates these creatures did not walk upright, and they were not intermediate between ape and man. Dr. Oxnard has studied the postcranial skeleton of these creatures. He studied the foot bones, the leg bones, the knee joints, the pelvis. All of that evidence And Dr. Oxnard says, based upon his research, using the most sophisticated methods of anatomy available, that these creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate between ape and man, and they certainly are not our ancestors. Interesting, Dr. Sarich showed the slide of Dorothy Lamour sitting next to a chimpanzee with their legs crossed and looking similar. And he says, look, see for yourself how similar they are. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I will believe Dr. Sarich that he really believes they're that similar the time he takes the chimpanzee and gives me Dorothy Lamour. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on this slide, you see a reconstruction of animals whose fossils are found in so-called Cambrian rocks. Now, in these Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of tremendously complicated invertebrates, sponges and jellyfish and trilobites and sea urchins and sea lilies and clams and snails and brachiopods. These things are tremendously complicated, very highly complex creatures. Evolutionists believe that these invertebrates, that is, they do not have an internal skeleton, these invertebrates evolved from a little microscopic single-cell organism. They believe that that organism arose 3.5 billion years ago. They believe that these animals all appeared about 500 million years ago. So, supposedly during a period of about 3 billion years, one of these little microscopic organisms, maybe an amoeba-like creature or a bacterium, evolved into these creatures and diversified into these great array of very complicated creatures. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, in the rocks that are supposed to be older than these rocks, we do find fossils of bacteria and algae. These are little single-celled, microscopic, soft-bodied organisms. Listen, wouldn't you agree that if we can find fossils of bacteria, we could find fossils of everything intermediate between those creatures and these creatures? Why, of course. Why, our museum should have thousands, they should have millions of fossils of those intermediate forms, showing the gradual evolution of these creatures. As a matter of fact, ladies and gentlemen, we've never found one. Not one. None. None of these creatures have any ancestors. We've never found ancestors for jellyfish, or for trilobites, or for sponges, or for clams, or snails, or sea urchins. Each one of these creatures appear fully formed in the fossil record. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that just settles the question. There is no doubt about it. Evolution has not occurred. All of these invertebrates, every one of them, appear fully formed right at the start, precisely as predicted by the creationists. Powerful, positive evidence for creation. Ladies and gentlemen, look, it's just not possible to have all those hundreds of millions of years of evolution, all of those billions times billions of intermediates living and dying, and we can't find a single fossil. You see, the sudden appearance of all of these great variety of complicated invertebrates without a trace of an ancestor is powerful evidence for creation. It settles the matter. Now, furthermore, one of these invertebrates supposedly evolved into fishes. Fishes supposedly were the first vertebrates. They have internal skeleton like you and I. They have a backbone. What a tremendous change to go from a clam or a snail or a worm or a sea urchin into a fish, an invertebrate evolving into a fish. And they say it took 100 million years. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the number of intermediate forms that would have lived and died during that 100 million years would be billions times billions. And there'd be many, many, many thousands of intermediate stages. Our museum should have millions of those fossils. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't have one. Not even one. And there's no question about it. There's no quarrel. There's no dispute about that matter. Evolutionists say, you've got us there. They say there's no doubt about it. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about has appeared fully formed right at the start. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about has had its origins firmly based in nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, fishes are supposed to be vertebrates. They're supposed to be our ultimate ancestor among the vertebrates. They have no ancestors. Therefore, we have no ancestors, you see. Now, if Dr. Sarich wants to believe that fish evolved from invertebrates, he can believe it. But it's a blind, irrational, pseudo-scientific faith because the evidence clearly shows there are no ancestors for fishes anywhere up on the face of this earth, and we have tens and tens and tens of millions of fossil fishes in our museums, but not one single ancestor. That settles the question. Let's go home, ladies and gentlemen. The debate's over with. Well, let's persevere. Let's look at some other creatures. The next slide. That fish is supposedly the ancestor of amphibians. In the lower portion of the slide, we see the world's oldest known amphibian. Now, they believe, but look at the fish. Now, let me repeat that, ladies and gentlemen. That's supposed to be the ancestor of amphibian. This is supposed to be the world's oldest known amphibian. But what do you see? You see a fish with a lovely set of fins, don't you? What do you see down below? You see an amphibian with feet and legs. Not a single intermediate has ever been found. Next slide, please. And here we see an exhibit in the Chicago Museum of Natural History. On the right we see the fish, on the left we see the amphibian, and in between we see a remarkable transitional form, part fish and part amphibian. Isn't that remarkable evidence for evolution? Why, it must have convinced tens of thousands of people of the fact of evolution. But if they'd taken time to read the fine print under that intermediate form, they would have found that it was labeled inferred intermediate. Why, inferred indeed. It's just strictly imaginary. No one has ever been able to find such a creature. The scientists couldn't produce it, so they had the artist produce it. That's not science, that's artistic license. And it's also an admission of failure. Again, millions and millions of years of evolution, but not a single intermediate form. Next slide, please. What about flight? What about the origin of flight? What about the origin of flying insects? What about the origin of birds? What about the origin of flying reptiles? What about the origin of bats, the flying mammals? Why, we ought to have thousands and thousands and thousands of intermediate showing the non-flying animal gradually evolving into the flying animal. Here's a fossil dragonfly, supposedly 380 million years old. What is he? A dragonfly. Every fossil we find of flying insects is complete. You see, evolutionists argue among themselves what on the non-flying insect evolved into wings. Why do they argue? Why isn't it settled? Because they've never found one single intermediate between a non-flying insect and a flying insect. And we have many, many, many different kinds of fossils of non-flying insects. We find fossils of mites and spiders and daddy long-legs and centipedes, supposedly between 300 and 400 million years old. And what are they? Mites, spiders, daddy long-legs, and centipedes and so forth. We have all kinds of fossils of flying insects, but not one single transitional form. Isn't that incredible? Next slide, please. Here we see a flying reptile. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you what Dr. Gish-Sarich and evolutionists believe. That's what they must believe. Millions of years ago, there was an ordinary land reptile. And then he had a genetic accident. A genetic mistake occurred, and his fourth fingers got just a wee bit longer. Somehow that conferred survival value. And so in the struggle for existence, the reptile with a slightly longer finger replaced the original. And then thousands of years later, after a lot of bad mutations, we got another happy accident, and the fingers got just a wee bit longer. Struggle for existence, replacement, and then we had thousands and thousands of these genetic mistakes, and the fourth fingers got longer and longer and longer and longer. And would you believe it, at the same time, other genetic mistakes from mutation created the wing membrane, the flight muscles, the hollow bones, and then in this pteranodon, changed jaws and teeth into that long, toothless beak. Let's think about that a minute. Here we've got this reptile, and he's just doing a beautiful job. He runs around with great agility and speed. He catches prey. He evades his predators. And then he has a mutation, and mutation, and mutation. And after a while, he has 25% wings, and about 75% of his forelimbs are left. He can't fly, but he can't run any longer. He's dragging those things around on the ground. What an awkward creature. Why, he couldn't catch his prey, he couldn't evade his predators, he'd simply be eliminated. Why, the idea that something like that occurred and the thing survived, let alone being superior, is rather absurd, isn't it? And ladies and gentlemen, there is not a trace of an intermediate stage. These flying reptiles just suddenly appear, just as you see them on the screen. Not a trace of an intermediate form or an ancestor has ever been found. Isn't that incredible? Millions and millions of years of all of this evolution and not a trace of an intermediate form. How could the fossil record be so cruel to evolutionists? The next slide, please. And here is the flying mammal, a bat. A bat is a mammal, so supposedly evolved from a rat or a squirrel or something like that during millions of years of time. In that case, all of the fingers had to get longer and longer and longer, and the wing membrane, flight muscles had to be generated, and that incredibly complex sonar system had to develop, you see, just by chance, just by accident, just by these genetic mutations, with no purpose, no design, just by chance. Well, in any case, again, you would have many, many intermediate stages. Not one, as Dr. Gish-Sarich said, but many intermediate. Why, the rabbit or the squirrel or the rat or whatever that evolved into a bat just didn't suddenly become a bat. Millions of years of evolution. We ought to have vast number of intermediate stages. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you're looking at the world's oldest known bat. Appeared on the cover page of Science, December 9th, 1966. Dr. Glenn Jepson, the author of the article, claimed that these fossil bones were found in rocks 50 million years old. He said nothing related to a bat has ever been found that's older than that. We see a reconstruction also of what the bat must have looked like. All right then, according to evolutionists, there we have him, the world's oldest known bat. What is he? 100% bat. He's essentially identical to a modern bat. He appears fully formed without a trace of an ancestor, without a trace of a transitional form, and essentially no change since he appeared supposedly 50 million years ago. And from the study of the structure of their skull, they were able to determine that that bat had the sonar system found in many modern bats. I want to show a picture of Archaeopteryx. There he is, thank you. But Dr. Gish-Sarich and evolution say, oh, wait a minute, don't forget Archaeopteryx. All right, let's don't forget Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx, as you see, was a bird. This bird was supposed to be 150 million years ago. How much? 2 million, oh my. He's supposed to have appeared 150 million years ago, and this is, of course, just a reconstruction. Now, you see, he was a bird. He had the basic form and pattern of the avian wing. He had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds. And he had perching feet and a bird-like skull, a furcular wishbone. He was a bird. And we find no intermediate between this bird and a reptile or anything like that. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, just recently they found fossils of a bird in Texas, supposedly 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. Obviously, then, if evolution is true, they'd be much more reptile-like than Archaeopteryx. It turns out that they're even more bird-like than Archaeopteryx. Just precisely the opposite that an evolutionist would expect. So we see then from the origin of flight, birds, bats, flying reptiles, flying insects have each appeared abruptly fully formed with no intermediate forms. And quickly, 1 minute, the next slide, the different kinds of, well, go ahead, next slide please, the different kind of dinosaurs, the horned dinosaurs, next slide. Stegosaurus with the spikes on its tail and those plates, next slide. We see the tail of this Stegosaurus with those unusual spikes fully formed at the start. Next slide. And the duck-billed dinosaurs. Next slide. We see the duck-bill of this Trachodon. Boldly, jaws and teeth gradually evolved into a duck-bill. Absolutely no intermediate. The next slide. And the Brachiosaurus, standing 50 feet high, enormous, weighing up to 100 tons, and with these nostrils not located out on the end of the snout, but in the bony dome on the top of the head. Not one single intermediate showing the nostrils migrating from the snout into the bony dome on the top of the head. Not any transitional form whatsoever. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope to deal with another subject, but I've run out of time, so just let me say this. Harlow Shapley of Harvard University said many years ago that we have a choice. He said, some people piously proclaim in the beginning God. I say in the beginning hydrogen. You have the choice, ladies and gentlemen, to believe that hydrogen is your creator or God. I say the best scientific evidence we have today tells us in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you very much.
What makes an expert? And more important, how do you know who is an expert, and who is an idiot expert? And that's not our choice to make, that is mine and Dr. Gish's, that's your choice to make. And let me point out that some people who are experts can say the most remarkably stupid things. And I like to make a collection of these. For example, one of this country's leading evolutionary biologists and the author of perhaps the best-selling college textbook in the subject called Evolutionary Biology, Doug Fatoyma of SUNY Stony Brook, wrote, and I am not quoting out of context, it was a rebuttal to an article on homosexuality. He says, as far as I am aware, there is as yet no evidence that male-female differences in sexual activity have a biological rather than cultural basis. We teach little girls how to be little girls and little boys how to be little boys, and our evolutionary history has nothing to do with it. This is from an evolutionary biologist. And I can't help adding, one can't help wondering about whether he is aware at all. Or you have one of his Eastern colleagues, Richard Lewontin, who is perhaps America's leading population geneticist, perhaps the world's leading population geneticist, saying, there is nothing in Marx, Lenin, or Mao that is or that can be in contradiction with the particular physical facts and processes of a particular set of phenomena in the objective world. He also says, now this is a geneticist saying, nothing we can know about the genetics of human behavior can have any implications for human society. You can find quotes supporting any position on any subject you care to choose. And Dr. Gish is a very selective quoter. Let us, for example, consider Sir Sally Zuckerman. And Zuckerman and Oxnard and others of that school are claiming that the Australopithecines were not bipeds. Now, look. African apes, to which we're doing a comparison, all right, when they're on the ground, do this. Boom. Or 4-point. Boom. Just like human football players. Now consider what Zuckerman and Oxnard are saying. These things are not bipeds. Their pelvis makes it certain that they're not quadrupeds. Hey, what else is there? You can't be a triped. So what were they? Well, Zuckerman and Oxnard don't tell us what they were. They keep telling us what they weren't. And Zuckerman says, it may well be that some feature or group of features in a fossil bone, maybe those having some definable mechanical significance, proves to be more like the corresponding features in man than in the living apes. Almost invariably, other features in the same region would be likely to turn out far more ape-like than human. In combination, we end up with something that differs from both men and apes, and which thus would be unique. What conclusion does one then draw, one might ask? Zuckerman goes on. Are we to suppose that the fossils are ancestral to one group or the other, or to neither? That is the sort of question people try to answer. But we have to recognize that it is at the same time the sort of question which is not amenable to any answer which would be scientifically final. That's all right, you can believe that, but if you believe that, then anything you say about what's related to what, or what evolved from what, or what didn't evolve from what, is totally irrelevant. Now, I think that the Piltdown situation is also an interesting matter. I want to point out, of course, first, that it was not anybody other than scientists who finally discovered the Piltdown fraud, hoax. But I also want to point out that there were a lot of scientists around who did not take Piltdown seriously, a lot of them. In 1914, 2 years after Piltdown was, quote, found, unquote, William Gregory, who was then America's leading mammalian paleontologist, wrote, it has been suspected that by some that geologically these specimens are not old at all. Now listen, that they may even represent a deliberate hoax. A Negro or Australian skull and a broken ape jaw, artificially fossilized and, quote, planted in the gravel bed to fool the scientists. 1914, and Gregory not only said that, he also showed this picture. And here we have, the picture on the right is perhaps a little more illustrative, just the outside and the inside of the jaws. On top, a modern human mandible. On the bottom, no, never mind, on the middle, Piltdown, okay, and on the bottom, a female orang's jaw. And that thing in the middle is character for character, essentially identical to the thing at the bottom. Well, of course it is, because it is a female orang's jaw. All right? And Gregory knew it. Why else would he do that? Why else would he do that? And Franz Weidenreich, who was really the kind of discoverer of Peking man, or certainly the describer, never took Piltdown seriously. And he called it a chimera. Now, what is the definition of a chimera? A creation of the imagination, an impossible and foolish fancy, a mere wild fancy, an unfounded conception, or in biology, an organism containing tissues from two genetically distinct parents. Yeah, a cranium from humans and a jaw from an orangutan. So, my point here, just a little bit of rebuttal. My point here is that you can, if you want to go out there, and you don't have to look very hard, you can find, quote, expert testimony to support any position you want on any subject under the sun. All Dr. Gish and I are doing up here is trying to give you some things to think about. Not hopefully to support your beliefs in one direction or another. No. We're trying to give you some things to think about. Whether you believe your species was specially created, or whether you believe that your species evolved, you do have an intelligence. Whether it is God-given or otherwise is neither here nor there. If you don't use it, you are hurting only yourself and in particular your children. And if you believe you are specially created and you don't use that specially given intelligence, you are of course blaspheming. So you don't listen to Dr. Gish or myself and believe or disbelieve. What you do is you go out there and you think about what we've said. And you think about the evidence. Not what we've said, but what's out there. And then you draw some conclusions. And whether you support me or Dr. Gish or neither is neither here nor there. The point is what it does for you, your family, and so forth. And I'm going to leave you with that.
And I really appreciate that, Dr. Sarich, and I would agree. I want people to think about that. I want them to consider this evidence, and having been fully informed, having heard both sides, then to make an informed, intelligent decision what you think to be more reasonable or more credible. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the second time I've seen Dr. Sarich demonstrate the football stance and compare it to that of an ape. And it's supposed to prove something or other. Now listen, if that's supposed to prove something or other, what the human does, where should he go? To football players? Of course not. That's what they do because that gives you an advantage in charging the other line. Go look, see what a child does. See what a baby does. Does a baby walk around like that? No, he crawls. And that has nothing to do with the knuckle walking of apes. And that shows then that humans did not come from apes. Now, as far as Lord Zuckerman is concerned, ladies and gentlemen, he was a real expert. He did his research. He considered the evidence very, very carefully. And ladies and gentlemen, this was Lord Zuckerman's conclusion, published in Beyond the Ivory Tower, published in 1970. After his lifelong search for the ancestry of man, this scientist, this evolutionist, had this to say, because he certainly wasn't a creationist. He said, and I quote, "No scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation." End of quote. So Lord Zuckerman is saying that if we exclude the possibility of creation, then obviously man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there is no evidence for it in the fossil record. Now, I want to thank Dr. Sarich for helping me out on Piltdown Man. What he pointed out was very valuable to my case. He said, Dr. Gregory, this expert, saw that it was a fraud. He could see that. It was there plain to see. Then why didn't all these other experts see that? Why did the consensus of the world's greatest expert that Piltdown Man was a genuine evolutionary ancestor of man? Why did the consensus of these experts was that Piltdown Man was a genuine, bona fide evolutionary ancestor of man? You see, if it was that plain, as Dr. Sarich claims, why did all these experts believe otherwise? Just exactly what I told you. It's because that's what they wanted to believe. That's what they thought they ought to be seeing, you see. The evidence was there, supposedly, but they didn't see it because they didn't want to see it. They wanted to believe in evolution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what about this evidence from molecular homology that Dr. Sarich spent so much time on? Oh, by the way, before I get into that, let me deal with ordinary homology. He showed different forelimbs from man and different animals and say, look, they're similar. Similarity, he says, proves common descent. Proves evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, proves no such thing. The only thing it proves is that there are similarities between animals. That's the only thing it proves. He assumes that that indicates evolution from a common ancestor. Ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't prove any such thing. Now, I don't have time to go into the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, but here's a little Oxford Biology Reader published in 1971 by Sir Gavin de Beer, the British biologist and evolutionist. It is about this subject of homology, the possession in different animals of similar structures. What is the title of that little booklet? Homology, an Unsolved Problem. Dr. Sarich says the problem is solved. These similar structures in different animals exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor. Hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of problems with that. In most cases, the assumed common ancestor doesn't even have these structures. Obviously, they could not have inherited them from a common ancestor. And there is so much contrary evidence to that, and particularly from genetics, that is, the actual scientific evidence is contradictory to the notion that these similar structures in different animals exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor. The evidence is so contradictory, Sir Gavin de Beer says this idea of homology is an unsolved problem. And he points out the evidence that is contradictory to this notion that these similarities exist because they have been inherited from a common ancestor. They exist because different animals had similar needs. And a wise, all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient master engineer devised similar structures for similar problems and not any evolution from a common ancestor. What about the molecules that Dr. Sarich wants to talk about? And he has shown something like this. Here is something derived from Dr. Sarich's work. And look at all those numbers, and sure enough, they add up just the way they ought to add up. We get this tree. And you would think that there's a molecule here that he checked, and a molecule here, and a molecule there, and a molecule here, and all that. And all of those things were determined, and the numbers were determined, and that's what you get. Actually, ladies and gentlemen, that is the actual evidence that we have right there. Only those terminal forms, only the differences between these different creatures, all of these numbers drawn in there is just based upon the assumption of evolution. Ladies and gentlemen, from something like this, the only proof of evolution is the assumption of evolution. Here, Dr. Sarich has challenged us to give an alternative interpretation of that data. How else, he says, could you examine that data and get anything except this tree like that? That's what he said. That's the only thing you can get. Well, ladies and gentlemen, here's the publication from an evolutionist, two evolutionists, Christian Schwabe and Gregory Warr, published in Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, spring of 1984. And Dr. Sarich has an article in press in that publication, a very highly recognized publication. And now, what these two scientists, now listen, Christian Schwabe and Gregory Warr are evolutionists. But they don't believe in this molecular biology tree. What they point out, there is an alternative explanation. They said, you see, this is what we do have. Just the tips of the branches. That's the only information we have. All of this below that is just inference, just based upon the imagination. These molecules don't exist at all. The numbers that are drawn in are just based upon these assumptions. They said it is as reasonable to conclude that those genes were there at the very beginning. And there's been no tree at all. Those genes were there potentially to give rise to species. Now, they believe that in each case, these genes evolved. The creationists do not believe that they evolved, neither does Sir Fred Hoyle, Professor Wickramasinghe, and others like that, but that they had to be created. These people are evolutionists. And you see, they get exactly the same thing that the creationists get, that there have been separate and distinct right from the beginning. Well, actually, according to Gregory Warr and Christian Schwabe, the molecular data is contradictory to that. Also true of Jeffrey Schwartz, an evolutionist at the University of Pittsburgh. The molecular data, and Dr. Sarich would support this, supposedly shows that man is more closely related to a chimpanzee than he is to the orangutan. Dr. Schwartz says, based upon morphology, there is tremendous evidence that man is more closely related to the orangutan than he is to the chimpanzee. Now, something is wrong here. Something is totally inconsistent. You see, while their basic assumptions are just simply false. Now, Dr. Sarich has mentioned that the resistance of bacteria to antibiotics is proof that good mutations do occur. And that these bacteria were not resistant to the antibiotics till they were exposed to the antibiotics. And they evolved, they changed. They created this resistance to the antibiotics in reaction to the antibiotic. Ladies and gentlemen, that is just simply not true. Those bacteria were resistant to those antibiotics long before the antibiotics ever came along. A drug company had frozen a culture of bacteria before antibiotics were ever introduced. They'd never been exposed to antibiotics. After the antibiotics were developed, years later, they thought out this culture, exposed it to antibiotics, and they were resistant to 6 different antibiotics. Never having seen an antibiotic ever in their history, they were resistant to these antibiotics. Let me just say this. Consider all of the evidence, the weight of the evidence. Look at the fossil record. Ladies and gentlemen, tremendous. I don't see how anybody could believe in evolution. And when you consider that evidence, how could all of those invertebrates evolve during hundreds of millions of years and not have one single intermediate? How could invertebrates evolve into fishes during 100 million years, producing billions times billions times billions of these intermediate forms, and we can't find one? Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to believe in evolution, that's your privilege. It's a free country. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not a rational belief. It is an irrational, unscientific belief. Today, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence, I say, demands creation. Thank you.